Hello and welcome to The Edge, where we'll take an in-depth analysis of today's top stories by looking beyond the edge. We'll bring you not just the facts, but also deep insights into the topics with expert opinions and social media reactions. Let's make a start with our look beyond the edge. Protesters angry about water shortages took to the streets of southwest Iran with mounting violence, while Tehran residents chanted anti-government slogans. Videos uploaded by social media users showed security forces using tear gas to disperse protesters. What is the Iranian government doing to solve the crisis? Britain demanded that the European Union agree to rewrite the Northern Ireland Protocol, which covers post-Brexit trade involving the province, just a year after it was agreed. The EU immediately rejected that call, saying that Britain needs to respect its international obligations, and pointed out it had been negotiated by Prime Minister Boris Johnson. But what is the Northern Ireland Protocol? PFIZER and BIONTECH say that they have struck a deal with South Africa-based company BioNTech for the production of COVID-19 vaccines for the African Union. Ingredients to produce the jabs will arrive from plants based in Europe, while the manufacturing of finished doses will start in 2022. And such agreements helps African countries to speed up their vaccination rollouts, as they have some of the lowest vaccination rates worldwide. Those are the top three stories that we'll be taking a look at today from Beyond the Edge. Let's get started. KHUZESTAN residents have pointed out on social media that the province has never truly had drinkable tap water, and they've had to buy their water or take it from rivers, many of which have dried up as well. Our following infographic explains the situation in KHUZESTAN. An Iranian police officer was killed during unrest in the country's restive southwest amid ongoing demonstrations over water shortages.
Protesters angry about water shortages took to the streets of southwest Iran for a 7th night in a row on Wednesday, with mounting violence while Tehran residents chanted anti-government slogans. Videos uploaded by social media users showed security forces using tear gas to disperse protesters. The semi-official Fars news agency said rioters shot dead one policeman and injured another in the port city of Mashhad in oil-rich KHUZESTAN province. In the town of IBRAHIM, demonstrators chanted "Riza Shah, bless your soul" in a video, referring to the founder of the Pahlavi dynasty, which was overthrown by the 1979 Islamic Revolution. Activists called for demonstrations to support the KHUZESTAN protesters, and videos surfaced late Tuesday and early Wednesday showing women chanting "Down with the Islamic Republic" at a Tehran metro station. At least 2 young men have been shot dead in the protests. Officials have blamed armed protesters, but activists said on social media they were killed by security forces. Iran's ethnic Arab minority, who mostly live in Khuzestan, have long said they face discrimination. An Arab woman protester could be heard shouting at security forces in one video, "Sir, sir, the demonstration is peaceful. Why do you shoot? No one took your land and water." Iran's worst drought in 50 years has triggered power blackouts. Iran's economy has been blighted by sanctions imposed by former U.S. President Donald Trump and the COVID-19 pandemic. Workers, including thousands in the key energy sector and pensioners, have protested for months amid discontent over mismanagement, unemployment, and inflation. The United States says it is closely following the protests, including reports that security forces had fired on protesters. At least 31 protests took place across Iran on Monday and Tuesday, including rallies by workers and farmers.
I'm now joined live from Tehran in Iran by Dr. Mohammad Marandi, who's a Tehran University professor and political commentator. Dr. Marandi, thank you for joining us again here today on The Edge. And
thank you for having me.
A very different topic for us this evening. The oil-rich region of KHUZESTAN is facing problems due to water shortages, but these water shortages aren't anything new. Could you, before we talk about the what's happening in the last few days, what is the general situation in the region regarding the water supply and the difficulties there?
This year we've had a very severe drought, and the whole country is facing difficulty. And Khuzestan is facing a number of difficulties in addition to the drought itself. One is very high temperatures. The temperatures have gone above 50 degrees at times in certain areas. And also Khuzestan is somewhat of a dead end because the United States has destroyed Iraq. It doesn't trade much with neighboring countries. So most of Khuzestan's trade and most of its connections are inward towards Iran. So because of the devastating situation in Iraq, we have one problem. Because of the very high temperatures, we have another, and because of the drought, we have a third. And in addition to that, we have the brutal sanctions that Biden is pursuing that are an extension of Trump's sanctions, and they have caused problems with regards to development, whether it's electricity or whether it's with regards to water and other areas of development.
So specifically, there are infrastructure problems, and outside of oil production, is the area also used for other purposes like agriculture? Is this affecting the situation?
Yes, it is a center for agriculture, but one of the problems, and this is a problem that both some farmers are to blame as well as the government, and that is that a lot of rice is produced in Khuzestan, and that is despite the drought. And the government should have prevented that from taking place under these very severe circumstances. For 2 years, we had good rainfall and a lot of snow in the mountains, but this year it has been very bad. But one thing that I should add is that we should put this in context. Just a year and a half ago, General Soleimani, when he was murdered, the first city that his funeral passed through was Ahvaz, the capital of Khuzestan. And there were millions of people who flocked from across the province to participate in his funeral. So the propaganda that's being produced in the Western media or in the Saudi media, like Iran International, which belongs to Mohammed bin Salman, is very misleading. And therefore, I think it's, this narrative of Iran constantly collapsing, we've been hearing it for over 4 decades now, and I think we'll be hearing it for the next 4 decades as well. So
moving on to the situation this week, which again we're reading about in the international media, there are protests because people aren't getting enough drinking water. And on the one hand, it seems a reasonable thing to do to protest, and yet these have maybe been also blown out of proportion. What is the reality with the protests in the region there?
The protests are legitimate. They've taken place in many different towns. In the big cities, there hasn't been a water shortage, but in some of the smaller cities and villages, there's been a major problem with water, and especially during this terrible heat. But one thing that is unique to Iran, and I think your viewers should really take note of this, is that there is a host of Persian language media funded by Western governments and owned by Western governments, like BBC Persian, VOA Persian, Deutsche Welle Persian, as well as other channels such as Manoto, Iran International, which belongs to Saudi Arabia, and they are engaged, they constantly engage in psychological warfare in Iran, against Iran. And they produce videos that are unauthentic. Sometimes they use videos that were staged or videos that were from years ago, and they try to put them on television and create a sense among the audience that this is something that's current. And you have thousands of Iranian MEK terrorists who are based in Albania. They fought for Saddam Hussein during his invasion of Iran, his invasion of our country. And then they worked for the Americans and the Europeans. They work with the Israelis. They carry out terrorist attacks. They're based in Albania, and they have thousands of online soldiers, each of them with tens of accounts. So they wage this online warfare with numerous TV stations and hundreds of websites against Iran. There is more anti-Iranian Persian propaganda coming from outside the country than there is anything produced inside the country with regards to politics. So it's a huge war or psychological war that is being engaged by Western countries and their regional allies against Iran. So they try to make ordinary protests violent. They try to create fear. They spread rumors. And we have the MEK terrorists that even some of the Iranians living abroad that are affiliated with Western so-called human rights organizations, that they've admitted that the MEK terrorists have shot people. And one police officer was killed. 2 other people were killed, and the police believe that both of them were killed by these gunmen. So it's the narrative that's being produced in the West is very different from the reality on the ground.
Well, these types of black propaganda we've seen popping up all around the world and used in various nefarious situations, including against Turkey. So this is a concept which we're very familiar with here and are totally against at A News. Can you give us some examples of news, this black propaganda news that's been broadcast? Compare it with the reality.
So, for example, there was a picture of a woman who was drinking water from the ground, and then as if she was dying of thirst. And then later on, there was pictures that came out from different angles showing that this was staged and that she was like on a main street. Or clips from years ago where a couple of soldiers were killed. A few days ago, I woke up in the morning to this clip, and I was shocked. And then a few hours later, I discovered that this clip was from 9 years ago, and that sort of thing. So Iran International, which belongs to Saudi Arabia, BBC Persian, and the others, they're all constantly saying people have been killed, many are in hiding, no one knows how many are dead. Sometimes the BBC Persian tries to pretend to be more professional. It says that unconfirmed reports. But the reality on the ground is that they know that they're spreading false information, but it is a part of their government's media operation against Iran. So ultimately, the story goes that one police officer was killed, 2 other people were killed. Their own families said that the terrorists killed them. They
Right.
said so. And then three people, another instance is three people who were said to have been killed and their pictures were put online. They showed up and put out clips of themselves saying, "We're alive and well."
Well, I'm sure that their families were happy to see that that was the case, that they were still alive and well. Let's go back to the situation with the water. Now, has the government been able to do anything to alleviate the situation there?
The government is moving. There is a lot of criticisms directed at the government, at the current administration, the outgoing administration, which I think are valid. Some of the criticisms I think are not fair. But the incoming government has, President Raisi, or President-elect Raisi, said he's going to put a special person in charge of Khuzestan to manage the issue. Part of the issue is the drought and the heat, but part of it is mismanagement, and part of it is an issue that is, foreign actors are trying to make this and turn it into a crisis. So legitimate protests where ordinary people walk down the streets and are protesting the difficult situation, suddenly you have gunmen come in among them, firing shots into the air. These people can't do anything about them. They're the ones with the guns, and they complicate the situation. But the very fact that we see that a police officer is dead, and the very fact that the two people who did die were, their own families said that they were killed by these gunmen, shows where the root of the violence lies.
So, in fact, there are several issues all tied up together here. There's, on the one hand, there's the management of the infrastructure in the region. There's the use of black propaganda to show protests as something that they're not, and for some nefarious purposes. Also, there is the fact that people are rightfully complaining if they need the government to do something for them, and the government is trying to do something. You say I've heard they're bringing in lots of water bowsers to give potable water to people to drink. Now, the other issue that you mentioned earlier in this discussion was the fact that although it is a rich area, or potentially rich area because of the oil, that hasn't been able to be developed properly because of sanctions on the country. Is this one of the real examples of how sanctions are hurting ordinary people in Iran?
Without a doubt, although the invasion of Saddam Hussein against the country, which was focused on this particular province, created a lot of damage. And I think that after the war, the government should have prioritized Khuzestan more than it actually did. But that is not just a problem with this current or this outgoing administration. It's a problem, I think, with successive administrations. But the sanctions have had a huge impact. In Iran, we never had a shortage of electricity over the last couple of decades. It was very rare when the electricity would go out. But now it's becoming a recurrent issue because the government has been prevented from investing, and the private sector has been prevented from investing by the United States and its sanctions. When the United States tries to block the production of vaccines in Iran or the import of vaccines, you can imagine what they're trying to do with regards to infrastructure.
So where do you see the way forward from here? Obviously, as you say, with droughts and so on, there's nothing we can do to change the weather today, although, of course, the climate change debate worldwide is continuing, and hopefully that will help change the situation. But inside Iran, what can be done to prevent something, droughts like this in future years? Is there a plan afoot?
I think the most important thing is that the new administration should move away from liberal economics, especially when a country is under sanctions, and the government itself should be more involved in investment. That's, I think, a major flaw in the previous administration. Also, Iran should stop waiting for Western countries to implement the nuclear deal and to set aside their cruel sanctions. Iran should look for closer relations with Asian countries, with regional countries, neighboring countries in the global south in general. I think that Iran does have a very well-developed infrastructure in general across the country, and if the new administration pushes very hard to get involved itself in the development, especially in deprived areas, the problem can be resolved in a relatively short period of time. It's not going to be resolved overnight, but it will gradually be resolved. So I think a major problem is liberal economics.
Mm-hmm. And to prevent the misuse of protests by, as you say, by terrorists coming in to stir up the people and to make the situation worse, what can be done to keep things on an even keel in that situation?
That is an ongoing problem. The withdrawal of the United States from Afghanistan in that respect is a major plus for Iran. But Western countries and their regional allies, like the Saudi regime or the Israeli regime, their views regarding Iran are not going to change. Their problem with Iran is ultimately linked to Iran's position towards Israel. Iran is opposed to Israel as an apartheid regime, and that is an issue that cannot be resolved unless there is a change in Israel, where all people are treated as equal human beings. So for the time being, I don't see a change in Western policy towards Iran. And so the only way forward is for the Iranians to help people of the region to drive out the United States and its allies. That would be a major plus. But also, I think the government has to do a better job in relieving the stress among the people, despite the sanctions, and to be more self-reliant, as well as to pursue friends and allies outside of the realm of Europe and North America.
With the new government about to be seated, will they be able to carry this program forward? And how will we see Iran gradually change, if at all?
Well, it is very good news that the president-elect has said that he's going to put someone in charge for Khuzestan, someone special in charge. That means there's going to be a special focus on that province. But also, I think that from what we've heard from President-elect Raisi, he will be somewhat left-leaning, I think, in economic policy. And I think that's a good thing. Of course, these are my personal views. Not that I'm against the private sector, but I think that the private sector is not the solution. It can be a part of the solution, but it can't be the solution. And I think that the incoming administration is looking at the situation from this particular perspective as well. And I do think that Iran's relations with countries like China, Russia, Central Asia, and regional countries will improve, including with India, from my understanding. So as U.S. power gradually declines and we see a rise of new powers, I think that too will help decrease the pressure that comes from the sanctions.
Well, Dr. Mohammed Marandi, thank you so much for giving us the true picture of the water situation. Let's hope that any protests that remain peaceful, and that the people are able to get water to live their lives. Thank you so much for joining us here today on The Edge. There have been days of continuous protests in Iran's oil-rich Khuzestan province, while water warriors in the past have sent angry demonstrators onto the streets of Iran. In addition to all these problems, precipitation decreased by almost 50% in the last year, leaving dams with dwindling water supplies to feed the country. Coming days will show how the government will manage to solve the crisis. And we're now going to move on with our next subject to have a look at production of coronavirus vaccines in South Africa. Distributing vaccines against COVID-19 is the most pressing challenge of our time. Nobody wins the race until everyone is protected. Our following infographic shows the importance of the COVAX vaccine sharing facility. There's potentially good news on the horizon for African countries struggling to roll out vaccinations, as an agreement has now been made to boost the production of jabs in South Africa.
Pfizer and BioNTech have struck a deal with South Africa's BioVac Institute to help manufacture around 100 million doses a year of their COVID-19 vaccine for the African Union. The deal is to fill and finish the vaccine, the final stages of manufacture, where the product is processed and put into vials. It does not cover the complicated process of mRNA drug substance production, which Pfizer and BioNTech will do at their own facilities in Europe. The agreement comes as Pfizer and BioNTech try to sway World Trade Organization members from supporting a waiver on some intellectual property rights for COVID-19 vaccines.
Our transaction is the first in Africa, and it's actually the first in Southern Hemisphere. And I think that's significant. It's based on our capability that we have had thus far. And for Pfizer to entrust us and their partners, BioNTech, to entrust us with a fairly new and complex technology that, quite frankly, only in December was it proven that it actually works.
It will make BioVac, a joint venture between the South African government and private sector partners, one of the few companies in Africa processing and distributing COVID-19 shots, and the first to do so using mRNA technology.
And to discuss this good news, I'm joined live from Bath in England by Dr. Bharat Pankhania, who's a senior clinical lecturer at the University of Exeter Medical School. Dr. Pankhania, thank you so much for joining us again here today on The Edge. Now, also, it's great to be able to talk with some good COVID news with you. What can you tell us about this, this deal that's been struck with Pfizer, BioNTech and South Africa's BioVac?
So whilst I would celebrate a little movement, and I mean little, and I will explain later why, a little movement by Pfizer BioNTech, it is a step in the right direction, but it is not wholly good enough. What I mean by that is the deal has been struck for the South African firm to fill and finish the vaccine. In other words, it blends it, it bottles it, it packages it, and it finishes the product, fill and finish. What is not being done, which is what the World Trade Organization and South Africa and India and other nations are asking for, and America has acquiesced that it should happen, is technology transfer. So the mRNA, the compound that is made to then put into the vaccine to then give into people's arms, is still only going to be made by Pfizer BioNTech in Europe at its European facilities. So they do not want to do a technology transfer to enable Africans to make the vaccine from scratch.
And in fact, if we're going to look at the numerical basis of this, as you say, it is just a very small step. In fact, the whole COVAX program has delivered next to nothing, only 200 million vaccines globally, compared with the over 300 that have been delivered to people in the United States alone. So this is just a drop in the ocean. And as you quite rightly say, just 100 million more doses to be available next year is seems almost unbelievable. So, sorry.
I totally agree with you. It's unbelievable and unacceptable. And what riles me even more is that Pfizer, BioNTech, and all the other European-based manufacturers will talk in other languages like, look at us, how good we are. We are going into joint partnership with South Africa. And then when you read the small print is, this is finish and fill, or fill and finish. It is not technology transfer, and therefore 100 million doses next year, which is at least 8 months away, is nothing. It's not good enough.
Now, from a totally layman's point of view, fill and finish sounds like it should be something that could be put into operation more quickly than technology transfer, because if the product is being made in existing factories, the raw materials are being made in existing factories and shipped to be packaged, it would be much faster, I would imagine, than setting up a production line, making everything using from very raw ingredients. Why is that not important?
Well, as I said, it's a small step because it's existing pharmaceutical manufacturing capacity being modified to enable and accept a fill and complete of the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine. In other words, it's just finishing the end product. Pfizer could do that in Europe. It could do it anywhere. The narrative that we are helping the world by doing it in partnership with South Africa is ceremonial. It's symbolic. Because unless and until you also enable the Africans, South Africa, Egypt, there are other countries, Morocco, who can also manufacture these things from scratch, you don't want to relinquish the technology that you've acquired, which was funded by public money in the first instance.
But that public money was going in for the good of humankind, one would imagine. So what is the argument being made against the technology transfer?
Well, the argument, which is supercilious, is, oh, it will prevent further research and development because we've had to hand over our patents and our technology. That is just not true. We're in the middle of a pandemic, a vaccine that was developed by funding from the public purse, and the public purse who funded you were not assiduous enough in laying down strict guidelines like, when you make the vaccine and if it is successful, you would share it at cost price or make others to be able to manufacture it, or words to that effect. Those sort of things should have been done when they were being funded. Unfortunately, it was left on, we expect you will do that, but it wasn't written down.
So relying too much on people's goodwill, perhaps. Now, Johnson & Johnson have already begun a production in Africa. So how has that managed to get things started in Africa? I know the vaccination rates are still incredibly low.
So it's again similar. So with even the Johnson & Johnson finishing product, it is not from scratch. So little bits and pieces, the complicated, expensive bits, the technology is in Europe, and then the finishing is finally done in South Africa. What we do need is technological transfer temporarily in other parts of the world because the world is in dire straits. We need technological manufacture in Brazil, in Africa, in Asia, etc. We need a lot more vaccines in a short time.
So perhaps the question mark is, obviously the drug companies are there to make money, and in the long term they're afraid that they'll lose this ability to monetize their product. But as we very clearly are aware, in the short term the need is to get vaccines into people's arms. So what would you think would be the best course of action to keep both sides of the argument happy?
Oh, it's very simple. We've funded the pharmaceutical companies with public money, and they mustn't forget that. They got where they did because they were funded by public money, and therefore they ought to share their good luck in having successfully developed the vaccine. Going forward, we need a global task force properly funded by global nations with the research and development and manufacture of the vaccines for the public good for all of mankind. This can be done through the great offices of the World Health Organization, if only governments, and I'm really pleased that the government of Joe Biden has come along with this and said, for this pandemic, we need to do technology transfer. I'm surprised and upset that the European Union, United Kingdom, Australia, Sweden don't want to do this because they have the pharmaceutical companies in their country.
Now, we know the World Health Organization have been working very hard to promote vaccines around the world and to get people working together. And just a few days ago, ahead of the launch for the Olympics, which of course is starting tomorrow, Dr. Tedros Ghebreyesus said that the threat isn't over anywhere until it's over everywhere. Anyone who thinks the pandemic's over because it's over where they live is living in a fool's paradise. So he, again, is giving this message that we need to get this pandemic equally, fairly dealt with across the whole world. That's the important thing, isn't it?
Absolutely, and prevention works, and unless and until everyone is well, no one is well, and we really need to do this. It's pointless for all the Europeans and the Americans, North Americans, to be fully immunized and the rest of the world suffers. It makes me feel very uncomfortable that this is a clear indicator of the rich nations can do as they wish, and it was always ceremonial with regards to looking after the poorer nations, and the COVID-19 pandemic has exemplified that very clearly.
And this I think, is a reflection of the inequalities already existing around the world. We see Africa, we're talking about Africa and not being able to produce from scratch the vaccines. This is a general healthcare issue for countries like on the African continent, as well as in several other underdeveloped countries, is it not?
It is, absolutely. And really, with regards to world prosperity, we've got to allow people to have the means to manufacture, because it's a bit like if I give you fish, you will eat fish for a day. If I teach you how to grow and harvest fish and look after the sea and the oceans and the rivers, you will feed yourself forever. And it is the same analogy here. No one is going to make you poorer just because you've given them some technology to manufacture a vaccine in the middle of a crisis. Just be kind and share it. That's all.
So this seems like the obvious thing to do, as the benefit comes back to us by having protection from the virus in the long term. Of course, the big risk of not getting vaccines into everybody across every continent is that we might see more variants in the future. So shouldn't this be what is invigorating people around the world to put pressure on companies like BioNTech and Johnson & Johnson and others to make their vaccine distributed?
You're absolutely right, and we need good political leaders, and Joe Biden is one of them. He makes a big difference compared to President Trump. We need leaders like him to say that we need to suppress this infection globally, and we need to suppress it very fast. And if Joe Biden and there's nobody else, there was Norway, and there is a little bit from Germany. If we can get leaders to persuade the politicians that we need to put the fire out there, abroad, hopefully they will start doing that, because they're not well until you also put the fire out abroad.
And just finally, before we run out of time, I want to ask you just one final question. With the summer is well underway, people are going out, they're enjoying their gardens, they're enjoying going to meet their friends, and no doubt from tomorrow many of them will enjoy meeting together to watch Olympic sports and other sports. What are the key things that people like you and I and the person we pass on the street, what do people need to do to bring this pandemic to an end?
We need to suppress the infections. So if you can get immunized, please do get immunized as soon as possible. It will save your life. In the meantime, please don't get infected, don't infect other people.
And how should we do that?
Oh, wear your mask. Wear your mask properly and avoid the crowds. Avoid the crowds, avoid closed indoor places with poor ventilation. Keep alive for as long as possible. Good times will arrive. Just don't lose heart.
Thank you. I know it's a message I've asked you to repeat every time we see each other, but still some people don't hear it, so it needs to be told again and again.
I agree.
Dr. Pankaria, thank you so much for joining us again here today on The Edge. Now, the announcement of the partnership came amid growing calls to tackle a striking gap in global vaccine distribution. Unequal distribution has been a source of debate for months at the World Trade Organization, as developing countries headed by India and South Africa have been pushing a proposal to temporarily lift intellectual property rights on vaccines to boost global manufacturing capacity. Now, since coming into force at the start of the year following Brexit, the Northern Ireland Protocol has prompted disagreements with the European Union. Our following infographic has the details of the protocol. The UK government has demanded the EU renegotiate post-Brexit trading arrangements for Northern Ireland as rioting and business disruptions hit the restive province.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and with permission,
Britain has demanded a new deal to oversee post-Brexit trade involving Northern Ireland and warned the EU that London would be justified in unilaterally deviating from the deal it struck with the bloc just last year. The Northern Ireland Protocol was agreed by Britain and the EU as part of a 2020 Brexit deal, finally sealed 4 years after British voters backed the divorce in a referendum. The protocol essentially requires checks on goods between the British mainland and Northern Ireland. However, these have proven burdensome to businesses and anathema to unionists who are fiercely supportive of the province remaining part of the United Kingdom.
We have worked with the EU to try to address these challenges. Some avenues for progress have been identified in certain areas, but overall these discussions have not got to the heart of the problem. Put simply, we cannot go on as we are. We have therefore had to consider all our options.
Britain has called for a standstill period which would maintain grace periods already in place with a freeze on existing legal actions.
For 20%.
The ministers told Parliament the proposals would require significant change to the Northern Ireland Protocol.
Despite signing up to the agreement, Boris Johnson says that the protocol represented a huge compromise by the United Kingdom and has accused the EU of applying it too rigidly. Now the UK government wants to get rid of most of the checks and reduce the customs procedures in order to allow goods to flow more freely. The coming weeks will show if the EU will be open for dialogue after this rejection of the UK's call. Our analysts have provided their insights on today's top stories. Let's have a roundup of what they had to say. Before closing our programme, let's take a look at social media to hear your voices and reactions on today's top story shared with the hashtag Brexit. And here's what you had to say about Brexit on Twitter. Keith, or Lidsip Cobs, says they even argued at the time that no one needed to actually read it before voting it through Parliament, because they'd already talked about Brexit enough. And Cassandra, who's fully vaccinated, says, we were in the EU. Then we decided, not all of us, obviously, to leave and make things much more difficult for ourselves. No shortages of fresh produce and workers to harvest and transport it in other countries. But then they don't have Brexit. They still have COVID-19 and a reliable app. And Cheesley says, why would they renegotiate? Boris lied about no border in the Irish Sea, then feigns surprise and blames the EU when there obviously has to be to protect the GFA. It's ridiculous. Von der Leyen rejects Boris Johnson bids to renegotiate Irish protocol. And let's take a look at our video of the day, which tells the story of one of the youngest chess masters.
There was nothing else to do, so I was just like, why not go for it? I just like the way the pieces move and the beautiful aspect of the game, I would say, because like anything can happen at any given moment.
Being a refugee or asylum seeker, it can happen to anybody.
It's not that easy to leave your people behind, but we need to run for our safety. It's not like your heart wants to burst out. Every parent wishes success for their kids.
Just put in hard work. Hard work beats talent. Don't underrate anybody or overrate anybody. And just play your best.
So, with a message to challenge and believe in yourself, that's all for this episode of The Edge with me, Andy Boyns. Stay tuned, as we'll be back tomorrow with more in-depth analysis on the top stories and a look beyond the edge.